Lucas Hayes had been fixing broken music boxes all morning when he first noticed her. The woman sat alone in Murphy's Café across the street, a chair positioned perfectly to face the exit. She never looked at her phone, never read a menu, never relaxed. Her dark eyes swept the room every few seconds like a security camera scanning for threats. Her fingers drummed against the table in a nervous rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat as he watched through his workshop window. 3 days straight, same table, same anxious energy, same desperate attention to every person who walked through that door. On the fourth morning, when a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit entered the cafe, she shot up so fast her coffee cup rattled against the saucer. Lucas saw pure terror flash across her face as she searched frantically for another way out. Without thinking, he stepped outside his workshop and opened his door wide, catching her desperate gaze across the busy street. She ran to him like her life depended on it. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she slipped inside, trembling. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Lucas closed the door behind her and turned the lock, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The woman stood in the center of his workshop, her breathing shallow and quick, her designer coat incongruous among the sawdust and half-finished furniture. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose during her sprint across the street. Her clothes were expensive but wrinkled, as if she'd been wearing them for days. Lucas had learned to read people the way he read damaged wood, finding the stress points and hidden fractures that needed attention. "You're safe," he said quietly, the same tone he used with his 7-year-old daughter Maisie when she woke from nightmares. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing every tool, every exit, every potential weapon in the room. Lucas glanced through the window and saw the suited man emerge from the cafe, his head turning methodically left and right as he scanned the street. The stranger's movements were too deliberate, too practiced, like a hunter who'd lost the scent of his prey. The woman followed his gaze and pressed herself against the far wall, her back flat against a shelf of wood stain. "Thank you," she breathed, and Lucas caught something unexpected in her voice beneath the fear. Education, refinement, the kind of careful pronunciation that came from expensive schools. Mrs. Henderson from next door would call it breeding, though she'd say it with the particular disdain reserved for people who had more money than sense. Lucas had no such prejudices. Broken was broken, regardless of the packaging. "Coffee?" he offered, gesturing toward the small pot that perpetually brewed in the corner of his workshop. Sarah had bought that coffee maker 3 years ago, insisting that clients felt more comfortable when offered something warm. Even after 2 years, he still made enough for 2 cups out of habit. The woman nodded gratefully, and Lucas noticed her hands shaking as she accepted the steaming mug. She cupped it between her palms like it was precious, like warmth was something she'd been missing for a long time. Through the window, they watched the suited man climb into a black sedan and drive slowly down Main Street. Only when the car disappeared around the corner towards the highway did the woman's breathing begin to return to normal. Lucas had seen that same look on wildlife caught in headlights, the moment when the danger passed and survival instinct gave way to exhaustion. She sank into the old wooden chair beside his workbench, the same chair where Sarah used to sit and sort through broken things people brought for repair. "I can't tell you my name," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now but still careful. "Not yet." Lucas nodded, as if strange women fleeing from mysterious men was a regular Tuesday occurrence in Millbrook, Connecticut. He'd learned patience from 2 years of single parenthood and 20 years of woodworking. Some things couldn't be rushed, whether they were 7-year-old anxieties or damaged furniture that needed time to acclimate before repair. The woman's eyes landed on the music box he'd been working on, its intricate mechanism spread across his workbench like the bones of some delicate creature. "It's broken," she observed, and Lucas heard genuine sadness in her voice, as if the music box's silence was a personal loss. He explained how the spring mechanism had snapped, how the tiny dancer inside had lost her balance and couldn't find her rhythm anymore. The woman listened with an intensity that surprised him, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the workbench that matched the box's decorative engravings. When he mentioned that it had belonged to his late wife, something shifted in her expression. Not pity, but recognition, as if she understood the weight of keeping broken things that held memories. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the scattered pieces. Lucas hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Her hands moved with unexpected confidence as she examined the delicate springs and gears, her touch gentle but sure. She identified the problem immediately, a stress fracture in the main spring that Lucas had missed, hidden beneath years of accumulated dust and neglect. Together they worked in comfortable silence, her fingers smaller and more nimble than his, able to reach into spaces where his calloused hands struggled. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, they had the music box singing again, its melody sweet and clear in the dusty air. The sound drew Maisie like a magnet. Lucas heard her footsteps on the porch before she burst through the door. Maisie's backpack slid off one shoulder, and her cheeks were flushed from the walk home from Mrs. Henderson's house. She stopped short when she saw the woman, her natural 7-year-old curiosity overriding any sense of stranger danger. "Hi," Maisie said simply, the kind of direct greeting that made adults uncomfortable but seemed perfectly natural to children. "I'm Maisie. Are you helping Daddy fix things?" The woman's entire demeanor transformed. The careful guardedness melted away, replaced by something soft and genuine that Lucas hadn't seen since she'd run into his workshop. She paused, seeming to make a decision. "You can call me Celeste, and yes, I'm helping your daddy fix things." Maisie beamed and immediately launched into a detailed explanation of her day, from the math test she'd aced to the butterfly she'd found on the playground at lunch. Celeste listened with the kind of focused attention that adults rarely gave children, asking follow-up questions and laughing at all the right moments. Lucas watched this interaction with growing amazement. Maisie had been slow to warm to new people since Sarah's death, maintaining a polite but distant demeanor with everyone except Mrs. Henderson and her teacher. When Maisie asked if Celeste would stay for dinner, Lucas found himself hoping she'd say yes before he'd consciously made the decision to extend the invitation. Celeste glanced at him uncertainly, and he nodded. "Nothing fancy," he warned. "Maisie's in charge of dinner on Tuesdays. Fair warning, she has strong opinions about the proper ratio of cheese to macaroni." Dinner was a revelation. Celeste helped Maisie prepare what the 7-year-old grandly called gourmet mac and cheese supreme, which involved adding frozen peas and hot dog slices to boxed macaroni. They talked about everything and nothing. Maisie's upcoming school project on butterflies, the best techniques for sanding curved surfaces, whether chocolate chip cookies were scientifically superior to oatmeal raisin. What struck Lucas most was how naturally Celeste fit into their evening routine. She knew instinctively when to engage and when to step back, when Maisie needed encouragement and when she needed gentle correction. During the dishes, she and Maisie fell into an easy rhythm of washing and drying that reminded Lucas painfully of how Sarah used to make even mundane tasks feel like adventures. As they worked together, Lucas caught glimpses of who Celeste might be beneath the fear and secrecy. She knew things: how to identify different types of wood grain, how to encourage a shy child to tell stories, how to make grilled cheese sandwiches that were crispy on the outside and perfectly melted within. Her knowledge seemed eclectic, ranging from practical skills to cultural references that suggested extensive education. When Maisie mentioned her upcoming art project, Celeste offered suggestions about color theory and composition that went far beyond typical adult advice. The evening ended, with Maisie insisting that Celeste read her bedtime story. Lucas listened from the hallway as this woman he'd known for less than 12 hours brought Charlotte's Web to life with different voices for each character. Maisie's delighted giggles drifted through the house like music, and Lucas realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his daughter laugh with such abandon. When Celeste finally emerged from the bedroom, Maisie was fast asleep, her face peaceful in a way that had become increasingly rare. "She's beautiful," Celeste said softly as they descended the stairs together. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said finally. "But you should know, whatever brought you here, whoever you're running from, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Celeste turned to look at him then, and Lucas saw something crack in her careful composure. For just a moment, she looked impossibly young and utterly exhausted, like someone who'd been holding her breath for so long she'd forgotten how to exhale. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. When she asked if she could sleep on the couch, Lucas brought her blankets and an extra pillow without question. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Celeste would appear at his workbench each morning, her hands already reaching for tools as if she belonged there. They worked together restoring a 19th century rocking chair, their conversation flowing as naturally as their collaboration. Celeste had opinions about wood grain and joint construction that spoke to real experience, not just theoretical knowledge. When Lucas asked where she'd learned carpentry, her answer was vague, but her skills were undeniable. She worked with the confidence of someone who'd spent significant time with expensive tools and quality materials. They were working on a jewelry box with a complex locking mechanism when Celeste mentioned that her father had once owned a similar piece. The comment slipped out naturally, but Lucas caught the way she tensed afterward, as if she'd revealed more than intended. He didn't push, but he filed away the information along with other small clues. Her expensive clothes, her educated speech patterns, her familiarity with antiques that most people their age wouldn't recognize. "What happened to your wife?" Celeste asked suddenly, her question gentle but direct. Celeste's straightforward curiosity was refreshing. He told her about the accident, a drunk driver on a rainy night, Sarah coming home late from her book club, the phone call that split his life into before and after. Celeste listened without offering empty platitudes or trying to find silver linings, her presence steady and accepting. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Celeste said when he finished, and Lucas heard genuine regret in her voice, as if she truly mourned never having the chance to meet Sarah. They worked in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. That evening, Maisie announced that she wanted to make a special dinner for Celeste. "Like a thank you dinner," she explained seriously, "for helping Daddy and making good pancakes." Lucas watched his daughter plan the menu with the gravity of a head chef, consulting Celeste about dietary restrictions and favorite foods. They settled on spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, and a salad that Maisie insisted on calling fancy lettuce with fancy dressing. The cooking process took twice as long as usual, but Lucas didn't mind. His kitchen filled with laughter and the comfortable chaos of multiple cooks working together. During dinner, Maisie peppered Celeste with questions about her family, her job, her favorite things. Celeste answered carefully, sharing small truths while avoiding larger revelations. She had no siblings. She'd grown up in Connecticut. She liked art museums and old books and thunderstorms. Each answer raised new questions in Lucas's mind, but he respected her boundaries. Everyone deserved privacy, especially someone who'd literally run to his workshop seeking safety. After Maisie went to bed, Lucas and Celeste sat on the front porch, watching stars appear in the clear October sky. "I can't stay much longer," Celeste said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe." Lucas wanted to ask safe from what, safe from whom, but he held his tongue. Instead, he found himself saying, "You're welcome here as long as you want to be. Maisie would be heartbroken if you just disappeared." The words were true, but they didn't capture the full extent of his own feelings. Over the past few days, Celeste had become part of their routine, filling spaces in their lives that Lucas hadn't realized were empty. On Sunday, Maisie convinced them to attend the monthly art fair in the town square. Lucas rarely participated in community events, preferring the quiet of his workshop to the social obligations that reminded him of how his life had changed. But Celeste seemed genuinely interested, and Maisie was practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of showing off her new friend to the entire town. They walked through the stalls together, Celeste commenting knowledgeably on techniques and materials while Maisie absorbed every word like gospel. It was at Margaret Chen's pottery booth that everything changed. "My God!" Margaret said, her voice carrying across the small crowd. "Celeste Warren? Is that really you?" The name hit the air like a physical blow, and Lucas felt Celeste freeze beside him. Around them, other vendors and customers began to turn, recognition dawning on faces throughout the square. "Warren," someone whispered. "As in Warren Industries?" Lucas felt the world tilt slightly as pieces began clicking into place. Warren Industries, the company that owned half the commercial real estate in Millbrook, that employed a quarter of the town's population. He looked at Celeste, really looked at her, and saw the truth written in her pale face and panicked eyes. She wasn't just running from someone, she was running from everything. The crowd began to murmur, cell phones appearing as people started taking pictures. Lucas heard fragments of conversation. Thought she was in Europe. Engagement announcement. Family drama that painted a picture he was only beginning to understand. Celeste grabbed his arm with trembling fingers, her careful composure cracking like glass. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. "Please, Lucas, we need to go, now." They made it 3 blocks before the first news van appeared. Lucas pulled Celeste and Maisie into an alley between the hardware store and the bakery, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. His quiet life, his peaceful workshop, his daughter's carefully maintained routine, all of it was about to be turned upside down by whatever storm Celeste Warren had brought to their door. Maisie looked confused and frightened, sensing the adult panic without understanding its source. "I should have told you," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "Tell me now," he said quietly, aware that Maisie was listening to every word. "Tell me everything." So Celeste did. Standing in a narrow alley while news crews searched the streets around them, she told him about being Celeste Warren, heir to a business empire she'd never wanted. About parents who'd mapped out her entire life without consulting her, who'd arranged her engagement to Richard Blackwood as if she were a merger rather than a person. About discovering Richard's true nature, his casual violence, his complete lack of empathy. She'd run with nothing but the clothes on her back and what cash she could gather, spending weeks moving from place to place before ending up in Millbrook. The cafe had seemed safe, anonymous, until Richard's investigator had finally tracked her down. "So, the man in the suit," Lucas began, "was looking for me, yes. Richard hired private investigators. He won't let this go. He can't afford to. There's too much money involved, too much pride." Celeste's voice was steady now, resigned. "I thought I could disappear, start over somewhere small and quiet." Lucas looked at his daughter, who was trying to process information far beyond her 7-year-old understanding, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. These weren't his problems, this wasn't his fight, but Celeste had become part of their lives. More than that, she'd brought joy back to their house, had made Maisie laugh, and had filled empty spaces Lucas hadn't realized were still bleeding. The thought of her running again, of disappearing back into whatever nightmare she'd escaped, was unbearable. "Come home," he said simply. We'll figure this out." But even as they walked back to the house, Lucas could see news vans multiplying on Main Street like some kind of media infection. His phone buzzed with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and neighbors peered through curtains at the sudden circus that had descended on their quiet town. By evening, the story was everywhere. Warren heiress found in small town, runaway bride discovered, family drama unfolds in Connecticut. That night, after Maisie had gone to bed, confused and overwhelmed by the day's events, Lucas and Celeste sat in his kitchen and talked until dawn. She told him things the news stories wouldn't include, about feeling like a stranger in her own life, about art classes abandoned because they weren't practical, about every decision being made by committees of lawyers and accountants. She told him about loneliness that money couldn't touch, about the crushing weight of expectations she'd never chosen. "I understand if you want me to leave," she said as the first grey light of dawn crept through the windows. "I never meant to bring this chaos into your life. You and Maisie deserve better. The money doesn't matter," he said finally. "Your family doesn't matter. What matters is what you want, what makes you happy." It was the simplest truth he knew, learned through 2 years of grief and single parenthood, that life was too short and too precious to waste on other people's expectations. But even as he said the words, Lucas felt the weight of reality pressing down on them. What did it matter what Celeste wanted if she couldn't have it? What did it matter what he felt if the world wouldn't let them be together? The next morning brought reporters to his front door, cameras capturing every glimpse of movement through his windows. Lucas kept Maisie home from school, not trusting the circus outside to respect a 7-year-old's privacy. They huddled in the kitchen while news anchors speculated about his relationship with Celeste, about his motives for harboring the runaway heiress, about what this meant for the Warren family's business dealings. Lucas had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable, more angry at circumstances beyond his control. By afternoon, Richard Blackwood himself arrived. Lucas watched through the window as an expensive car pulled up behind the news vans, as a tall man in an immaculate suit emerged and strode toward the house with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Richard didn't knock. He simply walked through the unlocked front door as if he owned the place, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere from tense to dangerous. "Celeste," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. "Enough of this childish behavior. It's time to come home." He was handsome in the way that money could buy, perfect teeth, expensive haircut, clothes that cost more than Lucas made in a month. But there was something cold in his eyes, something that made Lucas step instinctively between him and both Celeste and Maisie. "She doesn't want to go with you," Lucas said quietly, his carpenter's hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Richard looked at him with the kind of dismissive assessment usually reserved for insects or other inconveniences. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew, and found Lucas wanting. "I'm the man telling you to leave my house," Lucas replied, surprised by the steel in his own voice. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Your house. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into, Carpenter? Do you know how much trouble you're in for interfering with family business?" The threat was clear, and Lucas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. This was what Celeste had been running from, not just an unwanted marriage, but this casual cruelty, this assumption that people were possessions to be claimed and controlled. "I'm not going back," Celeste said, stepping out from behind Lucas with a courage that made his chest tight with pride and fear. "I told you before, Richard. I told my parents, I won't marry you. I won't be part of your plans." Richard's expression shifted subtly, revealing something sharp and dangerous beneath the polished surface. "You will," he said with quiet certainty. Because the alternative is watching everyone you care about suffer for your selfishness. His gaze shifted meaningfully to Maisie, who was pressed against Lucas's side. "Get out," Lucas said, his voice low and deadly serious. "Get out of my house right now or I'll call the police." Richard smiled, but it was a predator's expression. The police. The same police department that depends on Warren Industries for half its budget? The same town council that my family's donations helped elect? You're out of your depth here, Carpenter. But Lucas had learned things about strength during 2 years of single parenthood, lessons about protecting what mattered that went deeper than money or influence. "Maybe," he said steadily. "But you're in my house, threatening my daughter, and I don't care who your family is or how much money you have. Leave, now!" For a moment the two men stared at each other, and Lucas saw something flicker in Richard's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at meeting someone who wouldn't be intimidated by wealth or position. Richard turned to go, but paused at the door. "You have 24 hours to convince her to be reasonable," he said without looking back. "After that, things become complicated, for everyone involved." That evening, after Maisie had finally fallen asleep despite the chaos and confusion, Lucas and Celeste sat in his workshop, among the tools and half-finished projects that represented his entire world. The music box they'd repaired together sat on the workbench between them, its melody box silent in the lamplight. Celeste picked it up with gentle hands, winding the mechanism and letting the familiar tune fill the quiet space. "I have to go," she said softly, not looking at him. "You see what this is doing to your life, to Maisie's life. Richard won't stop. He'll make things impossible for you here, your business, your reputation, your daughter's safety. I can't let that happen." Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to insist they could fight this together, but he could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the resignation that came from a lifetime of being treated as a commodity rather than a person. "What will you do?" he asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Celeste was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the music box's intricate carvings. "What I should have done from the beginning," she said finally. "Accept that some fights can't be won. Marry Richard, play the role my family wants, and try to protect the people I care about by staying away from them." The words hit Lucas like physical blows, each one driving home the impossibility of their situation. "That's not protection," he said urgently. "That's surrender. That's letting them win." Celeste looked at him then, and Lucas saw all the pain she'd been carrying, not just from the past few weeks, but from years of being valued for her name rather than her dreams. "Sometimes surrender is the only form of protection available," she said quietly. "Sometimes loving someone means walking away." They talked through the night, exploring options that all led to the same conclusion, that the world Celeste came from and the world Lucas inhabited were too different, the power imbalance too great, the stakes too high. Richard had resources they couldn't match, influence they couldn't counter, a willingness to cause collateral damage that made resistance seem impossible. By morning, they'd reached the heartbreaking decision that Celeste would leave Millbrook and return to her family's control. Lucas helped her pack the few belongings she'd accumulated during her stay. Sarah's cookbook with the pancake recipe, one of Maisie's drawings, the small wooden trinket box they'd made together during a quiet afternoon in the workshop. Each item felt like a piece of his heart being carved away, but he forced himself to smile, to make the leaving easier for her. Maisie cried when they told her, her 7-year-old heart breaking with the particular intensity that children brought to loss. "Will I see you again?" Maisie asked through her tears. "I hope so, sweetheart," Celeste finally said. "But sometimes grown-ups have to do difficult things, even when they don't want to." It was the best explanation they could offer, and Lucas felt his own throat close with emotion as he watched his daughter say goodbye to someone who'd become important to both of them. The black car arrived at noon, as promised. Not Richard this time, but a driver in Warren Industries livery, professional and impersonal. Lucas walked Celeste to the street, aware of the cameras documenting every moment. "Thank you," Celeste said simply, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "For everything. For safety. For kindness. For showing me what a normal life could feel like." Lucas wanted to say so much more, that she'd brought light back to his house, that she'd helped heal wounds he didn't know were still bleeding, that he was falling in love with her, quiet strength and gentle humor. Instead, he simply said, "Take care of yourself," and watched the car drive away, taking with it the best thing that had happened to his family since Sarah's death. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, Warren Industries had cancelled their contract with Lucas's biggest client. 2 of his regular customers found other craftsmen, citing pressure from their employers. The local bank, which held his shop's mortgage, suddenly required additional paperwork and collateral. Richard's promise of complications was being fulfilled with systematic precision, each pressure point carefully chosen to make Lucas's life difficult without appearing overtly vindictive. Lucas endured it all with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried him through Sarah's death and the challenges of single parenthood. He found new clients, took on smaller projects, stretched his savings to cover the gaps in income. But the loneliness was harder to bear. The house felt empty again, the workshop too quiet, the evening routine hollow without Celeste's laughter and conversation. Maisie asked about her constantly, and Lucas struggled to explain adult complications to a 7-year-old heart. 3 months passed in this grey existence, each day blending into the next with grinding sameness. Lucas threw himself into work, accepting projects that barely covered costs just to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. The music box sat on his workbench, silent now. He couldn't bear to wind it and hear the melody that reminded him of everything he'd lost. It was in February, during one of Connecticut's particularly brutal winter storms, that Maisie fell seriously ill with pneumonia. The hospital bills were mounting, and Lucas was forced to consider selling the workshop to cover the medical expenses. He was working late, trying to finish enough projects to keep them afloat, when he heard footsteps on his porch. Her expensive coat was dusted with snow, and her face pale with cold and exhaustion. "Mr. Hayes?" she said, her voice professional but urgent. "My name is Jennifer Morrison. I'm an attorney and I represent Celeste Warren. May I come in?" Lucas stepped aside, his heart hammering with sudden hope and fear. The lawyer declined his offer of coffee, sitting on the edge of his couch with the focused intensity of someone delivering important news. "Ms. Warren asked me to find you," she began. "She has something she needs you to know, something she couldn't risk communicating directly." The story Jennifer told was both shocking and somehow inevitable. Celeste had indeed returned to her family, had gone through with the engagement to Richard Blackwood as planned, but during the months of wedding preparations, she'd been quietly documenting Richard's business practices, his casual violence, his connections to increasingly questionable enterprises. Working with federal investigators, she'd built a case that had finally brought down not just Richard, but a network of corruption that had been growing for years. "The arrests happened last week," Jennifer explained. "Ms. Warren's cooperation with the investigation was instrumental in dismantling the entire operation." Lucas felt dizzy with the implications. Celeste hadn't just surrendered. She'd been fighting back in the only way available to her, using her position inside the corrupt system to expose it from within. "Where is she now?" Lucas asked, hardly daring to hope. Jennifer smiled for the first time since arriving. "Free," she said simply. Legally, financially, and personally free for the first time in her adult life. "She wants to see you," Jennifer continued, "but she's afraid that too much has happened, that too much time has passed, that you've moved on with your life. She asked me to give you this." The lawyer handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper, and Lucas recognized Celeste's careful handwriting on the address label. Inside, he found the wooden trinket box they'd made together, along with a letter written in her familiar script and a cashier's check made out to him for an amount that would cover Maisie's medical bills and more. The letter was brief, but devastating in its honesty. Celeste wrote about the months of pretending, of gathering evidence while maintaining the facade of a willing bride. She wrote about thinking of him and Maisie every day, about the lessons they'd taught her about real family and genuine love. She wrote about finally understanding what Sarah had meant about things being broken but repairable, about the difference between fixing something and making it new. She ended with an address in Hartford and the simple statement, "If you can forgive me for leaving, I'd like to try again." Lucas read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. Maisie appeared at his elbow, drawn by his stillness, and he showed her the trinket box with its familiar craftsmanship. "Is it from Celeste?" she asked with the intuitive understanding children brought to adult situations. When Lucas nodded, Maisie's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since autumn. "Are we going to see her?" she asked with such hope that Lucas felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. The drive to Hartford took 2 hours through winter slush and grey skies, but Lucas felt lighter than he had in months. He'd closed the shop for the day, arranged for Mrs. Henderson to watch Maisie after school, and driven toward whatever future might be waiting. The address led to a small apartment building in a modest neighborhood, not the mansion he'd expected, but something human-scaled and approachable. Celeste answered the door herself, and Lucas felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She looked older, more tired than he remembered, but there was something new in her eyes. "Lucas," she said softly, and her voice carried all the hope and fear and longing he'd been feeling for months. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure, I hoped, but I wasn't sure." They stood in her doorway for a moment, drinking in the sight of each other, before Lucas stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. She felt real and solid against him, not a memory or a dream, but the actual woman who'd shared pancakes and bedtime stories and quiet afternoons in his workshop. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry for leaving, for the way I left, for everything you've been through because of me." Lucas held her tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling pieces of himself slot back into place after months of displacement. "You don't have anything to apologize for," he said firmly. "You survived. You fought back. You won." And she had won, not just against Richard and the corruption he represented, but against a system that had tried to reduce her to a commodity. They talked for hours in her small, neat apartment, filling in the gaps of the past months. Celeste told him about the investigation, about wearing recording devices to dinner parties and documenting conversations that revealed the scope of Richard's illegal activities. She told him about the fear, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that one mistake could have been fatal. But she also told him about the moment she'd decided to fight back, sitting in a lawyer's office and thinking about his daughter's innocent questions and his steady hands and the life she'd glimpsed in his workshop. "I kept thinking about what you said," she explained, "about things being repairable if you had the right tools and enough patience. I realized that some things need to be completely rebuilt rather than just fixed, and that sometimes you have to tear down what's broken before you can build something new." She'd used her inheritance to fund the investigation, working with federal agents who'd been trying to build a case against Richard for years. Her inside knowledge and documented evidence had been the missing pieces they needed. "What happens now?" Lucas asked as the afternoon light faded outside her windows. Celeste took his hands in hers, her fingers warm and sure. Now I get to choose, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I get to decide what I want, who I want to be, how I want to spend my days, and what I want, what I've wanted since the moment I had to leave Millbrook, is to come home. The word home hung between them, carrying weight and possibility. Maisie asks about you every day, he said. She's never stopped believing you'd come back. Celeste's eyes filled with tears, and Lucas saw in them the woman who'd read bedtime stories with different voices, who'd helped his daughter make gourmet macaroni and cheese, who'd fit into their lives as if she'd always belonged there. I want to try, she said quietly. I want to see if we can build something real together. I know it won't be simple. There will be adjustments, complications, questions about our different backgrounds. But I'm not running anymore, Lucas. I'm not hiding. If you'll have me, I want to come home. Lucas answered by kissing her, pouring months of longing and loss and hope into the contact. She tasted like tears and possibilities, like the future he'd stopped believing in during the grey winter months. They drove back to Millbrook together, Celeste following in her modest sedan while Lucas led the way home. The town looked different in the evening light, not the hostile environment it had become during the media circus, but the peaceful community he'd chosen for raising his daughter. By the time they pulled into his driveway, Maisie was waiting on the porch with Mrs. Henderson, having spotted their cars from the kitchen window. Maisie launched herself at Celeste with the uncomplicated joy of childhood, her arms wrapping around the woman who'd been absent from her life for too long. I knew you'd come back, she said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who'd never stopped believing in happy endings. I knew it. Lucas watched them embrace and felt something settle in his chest. That night, after Maisie had finally been convinced to go to bed despite her excitement, Lucas and Celeste sat in his workshop, where their story had begun. The music box still sat on his workbench, and Celeste picked it up with gentle hands, winding the mechanism and letting Sarah's favorite melody fill the space between them. She would have liked you, Lucas said softly, watching Celeste's fingers trace the familiar curves and carvings. I hope so, Celeste replied. I hope she would have understood that I'm not trying to replace her, just add to what you and Maisie have built together. Spring came early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that extended far beyond the weather. Celeste moved into a small apartment downtown, close enough to be part of their daily routine, but separate enough to let their relationship develop naturally. She and Maisie established new traditions, Saturday morning art classes that turned the workshop into a colourful chaos of supplies and creativity, cooking experiments that usually ended in laughter and pizza, bedtime stories that featured increasingly elaborate character voices. Lucas watched his daughter bloom under the attention of someone who genuinely enjoyed her company. The art program she'd envisioned became reality, with the workshop serving as classroom space for children whose families couldn't afford formal lessons. By summer, the community had grown accustomed to seeing them together, Lucas and Celeste working side by side on restoration projects, Maisie chattering between them as she helped sand wood or sorted hardware. The media attention had faded, replaced by the comfortable anonymity of small-town life. People knew their story, but they also saw the daily reality. 2 adults who clearly cared for each other and a child who was thriving. The proposal came naturally, without fanfare or elaborate planning. They were working late one evening, finishing a dining set for a client, when Celeste looked up from the piece she was staining and said, I love this life we're building together. Lucas set down his brush and really looked at her, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, old clothes stained with wood finish, completely focused on the task at hand. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with money or social status and everything to do with contentment. Marry me, he said simply, the words emerging without conscious planning. Celeste's hands stilled on the wood, and she looked at him with surprise that quickly transformed into joy. "Yes," she said, equally simply. "Yes, absolutely yes." They sealed the engagement with a kiss that tasted of wood stain and sawdust and perfectly ordinary happiness, surrounded by the tools and projects that represented their shared future. The wedding took place the following autumn, exactly 1 year after their first meeting. It was small and intimate, just family and close friends gathered in the workshop where they'd fallen in love. Maisie served as flower girl, scattering petals with the serious concentration she brought to all important tasks. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears and proclaimed it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. The music box played throughout the ceremony, its melody weaving through spoken vows and whispered promises. Years passed in the comfortable rhythm of family life. Celeste's art program expanded, eventually requiring its own space and staff. Lucas's business grew as well, benefiting from his wife's business acumen and community connections. Maisie flourished, her natural creativity nurtured by 2 adults who understood the importance of both structure and freedom. They faced difficulties, financial pressures, parenting disagreements, the normal friction of combining different backgrounds and expectations, but they faced them together. On quiet evenings, Lucas sometimes thought about the woman who'd run into his workshop years earlier, desperate and frightened and carrying secrets that had threatened to destroy them all. Celeste had become the artist she'd always dreamed of being, the mother Maisie had needed, the partner who made Lucas's own dreams feel possible. The music box still played every evening, its melody a reminder of Sarah's enduring presence and blessing on the family they'd become. Sometimes Maisie would wind it herself, sitting cross-legged on the workshop floor while her parents worked nearby. She'd begun learning to restore small items herself, her young hands surprisingly steady as she sanded rough edges and applied careful coats of finish. 10 years after that first desperate escape, Lucas stood in his workshop, watching his wife teach a group of teenagers the basics of wood carving. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the organized chaos of tools and projects that filled the space. Celeste moved among her students with patience and expertise, offering encouragement here, correction there, her hands steady and sure as she demonstrated techniques. Maisie, now 17 and already accepted to art school, helped with the younger students, her natural teaching ability a gift inherited from both her parents. That evening, after the students had gone home and the workshop had been cleaned and organized, the 3 of them sat on the front porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. It was their favorite time of day, the peaceful transition between work and rest, activity and stillness. Celeste leaned against Lucas's shoulder while Maisie sat on the porch steps, sketching the scene before them with confident strokes. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" Celeste asked softly, her voice carrying the comfortable intimacy of long marriage. Lucas considered the question, thinking about all the choices and chances that had led them to this moment. If Celeste hadn't chosen his workshop as a refuge, if he hadn't opened the door, if either of them had been too afraid to risk their hearts on something that seemed impossible from the beginning. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about this, right here, right now, and I can't imagine wanting anything different." Maisie looked up from her sketchbook, smiling at her parents with the tolerant affection teenagers reserved for embarrassingly romantic adults. The music box chimed from inside the house, its evening melody marking the end of another ordinary, perfect day. They sat in comfortable silence, 3 people who'd found each other through circumstances that could have destroyed them, but had instead created something stronger than any of them could have built alone. The future stretched before them, full of unknown challenges and unexpected joys, but they would face it together, as they had every day for the past decade, as they would for all the days to come. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like earthbound stars, and Lucas felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life well lived, a family well loved, and dreams that had exceeded anything he'd dared to imagine during those dark months after Sarah's death. Sometimes, he reflected, the most broken things created the most beautiful music when they were finally repaired with patience, skill, and love. Sometimes the most unexpected escapes led to the most perfect homecomings.